Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see so many of you here, and welcome to everyone who's joining us on the live stream for this really, for those of us involved in the project, exciting time when the whole period of work over the more than 2 years looking at the futures of tertiary education comes to the stage that we have a lovely printed summary of some of our activities to share with you, and of course to hear your views later on. My name's Anne Anderson, and I had the pleasure of chairing the project, and I'm joined by my colleagues from the Young Academy of Scotland, Alex Koenig and Peter McCall, and Carol Ledeker, who's from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, was also a key member of our little group, and Sandro Carnicelli, who's also here. So it's great to be able to share with you what we've been doing over this last period. It's been quite a challenging period, but we've been able to explore some of the issues about what might the future for tertiary education look like. And I just want to share what we were trying to do and what we hope you will find interesting that emerged from our discussions, our roundtables with a whole range of stakeholders in tertiary education. We weren't trying to be prescriptive, we weren't trying to do a systematic review. What we were trying to do was explore, in a sense, the lived experience and the key themes for a whole range of stakeholders in tertiary education, looking in that time frame potentially to 20 years ahead, not just what will happen next year or the year after. And we're trying to stimulate a debate and discussion. We're not trying to be prescriptive. We're not trying to say this is what the sector must do, this is what policy changes must happen. It's much more about stimulating a dialogue. So I hope you'll find some of the themes that emerged of interest. We certainly found the discussions we had with the range of stakeholders, sadly nearly all of which had to be on screens, were nevertheless very rich, and people shared a lot of interesting insights with us. And some of these themes we'll have the chance to share with you and to hear your views as the afternoon progresses. So Sorry. It was a very iterative process. We tried to follow what was emerging from our discussions. We started with learners, we went on to providers, we looked at other stakeholders and their aspirations and ambitions for the sector, but we tried to follow where the discussion and themes took us. And as I said, we looked at, obviously, current learners, current frontline staff and a whole variety of tertiary education institutions. We also looked at non-traditional providers, everything from the army to the prison service to industry. We looked at those involved in various interesting collaborations in tertiary education. And lest we became too focused on what was happening in our own backyard, we also did a round table with a range of international stakeholders who were also exploring these themes globally, so that we were grounding what was emerging both with a range of stakeholders within Scotland, but also further afield. And key themes did emerge, and what was interesting was that they emerged across many of the roundtables, whether it was international speakers, whether it was local students or staff, whether it was people involved in interesting tertiary education collaborations. This theme, this aspiration for greater flexibility and a greater and deeper sense of being learner-centred, a phrase we often use rather glibly in tertiary education, but I think from the work that was being expressed in the roundtables, people were aspiring to something much deeper and more meaningful. There was also a great interest in a different approach to the curriculum that was more problem-based, more societal challenge-focused, and that was more interdisciplinary, so less siloed work within disciplines or specialisms, and a much broader, more flexible approach to attacking some of the key challenges we face as a society. But the flexibility issue came up repeatedly. The demographics, the aspirations of learners are changing, and the notion that everybody will know what they want to do when they leave school and will do 2, 3, 4 years of full-time study and then fit on a career for life, that is certainly something that is already disappearing, and in the aspirations of many of our stakeholders going forward, far, far greater flexibility, the opportunity to mix and match, to have an articulated web of possible pathways that people choose in terms of their progression through tertiary education over their life course, not just in the years immediately leaving compulsory schooling. And this was really backed up by changes of learners' attitudes and aspirations. Yes, learners expressed an interest clearly in their career prospects and what employers were wanting, but over the course of their aspirations for a whole lifelong learning journey, they were also interested in other themes and questions of value and self-enrichment, and challenges of social justice and values also emerged. So it isn't only about how do we equip people for the workforce, important though that is. And some of the changes in the environment and the possible career paths that people will adopt also requires probably far greater flexibility than that we as a system are currently offering, but certainly over people's aspirations with their different chosen pathways, with their different lifestyles. That was something I think that came through very strongly and that we need to take seriously as we move forward. Partnerships came out as a key theme. We know in Scotland we're rightly proud of some of the collaborations and partnerships that already exist between colleges, universities, more novel new partnerships between groups of colleges, universities, employers. All of that is great. The question that we were exploring and that came up in our roundtables was, how do we make these sorts of initiatives more sustainable, more scalable, that don't depend on inspiring individuals and leaders, and that actually become system-wide rather than one-off interesting examples. So that notion of collaboration in the delivery of tertiary education was a really key feature. But also what came through was a desire for collaboration and co-production of the curriculum itself. And that came through both in our discussions with Scottish stakeholders and also with our international groups. So this idea of the co-production of the curriculum itself, again, a phrase that comes tripping off the tongue, but when you think about it, it's radically different than the kind of ways that we traditionally produce curricula for tertiary education at the moment. And what would that mean for this kind of flexible, learner-centred, collaborative, just-in-time aspiration that people have for their learning, because people also wanted to be able to have reskilling opportunities to acquire micro-credentials in response to changes in their aspiration or changes in the labour market. How do you fit this into this broader picture? And how do you collaborate beyond the normal, college, university, perhaps local authority or industry? How do you involve the views of community or society more generally in that co-production of what is a meaningful curriculum that people will genuinely want to study and will genuinely find self-enriching and potentially economically rewarding as well? There are lots of options starting to emerge out there. Not everyone, and I think the COVID pause has meant that people are having some more profound thoughts about what do I really want to do with my life, with my career, the sort of, it's an unfortunate phase, but kind of the conveyor belt of school, college, university, job is no longer something people necessarily all want to do in a fairly unreflexive way. People want to think more broadly about what is it they want to do with their careers, with their educational aspirations, with their lives. And if we don't adapt, there are other potential providers out there already emerging and potentially emerging more strongly in the future. Technology, we made more rapid change in tertiary education as a result of the pandemic than I suspect many institutions had done in 10, 20 years discussing how to involve technology more meaningfully. But it needs to be done in a way that's sensitive to what learners aspire and what they want, but also that is appropriate for the staff and the support staff who have to deliver and support such systems of tertiary education. And we were certainly very well aware when we were talking to frontline staff certainly very aware of the stresses and strains during the shift of the pandemic to the huge technology provision at fairly short notice, but how do we do that in a way that doesn't produce the incredible stress on those frontline staff that enables them to both be responsive to their learners, but also do the knowledge creation and all the other activities, the outreach, the community engagement that those frontline staff are involved in. So technology adaptation needs to look at that broader picture. We are not in the business of trying to come up with specific policy recommendations, but one thing that clearly emerged from all of this work was that there was an aspiration for something more like a lifelong learning funding opportunity that would be flexible and responsive to individual learners' needs and aspirations. How do we achieve that? And also, how do we achieve it in a way that doesn't bankrupt institutions or make the competition between institutions, which we heard about and which was seen as something that we need to move away from, because one of the strengths of the sector is its diversity. So how do we have this kind of flexibility of the learner-centred funding not leading to unintended consequences of added competition rather than collaboration? That's a big question. And how do you do that in a way that is participatory, not just amongst the funding bodies and the recipients of funding, but the wider stakeholders who benefit and who are responsible for tertiary education? So we produced this fine report, which I've seen for the first time today, which is we're very pleased about. But this is not the end of a journey. Some of you were with us a few weeks ago where we shared some of our preliminary thoughts in our first face-to-face event, where many of you sense-checked some of the themes that were emerging and also fed in your own views and perspectives given your expertise in the sector. And again, the challenges of interdisciplinarity, the challenges of working across boundaries, that was really important to hear. And I think in our question and answers and in our chair's discussion in a moment, we'll think a little bit about what's striking or significant about what has emerged from this process, but also if we take broadly that this is the direction of travel, what are the biggest challenges, what are the hurdles we as stakeholders in tertiary education more broadly would have to overcome. So we are delighted you're with us here today. We are not at the end of the journey. We're at a significant milestone, but we want to share this report more broadly. We want to hear your feedback. We're continuing to develop the resources that the project has been developing, and we'll hear more from Alice Koenig later about that. But really, it is great to have some of you with us on this journey up to today, and also to be here today to share your thoughts and aspirations. But I'll now turn to Peter McCall, who is going to take the lead on our question and answer session. Peter.
Sure. If you open up the report at the conclusion page, you see my face. It has to be emphasised that this is not conclusion. This is opening the debate. So you've all had time to read and thoroughly digest the contents of the report. Does anyone have any questions? No, seriously. We wanted to kind of open the debate around some of the themes that Anne has talked about, give you the opportunity to give us some feedback on whether you think we were asking the right questions, that you should have had time to digest those, and move on to a little bit of a debate about any of the conclusions that may have struck you from this, or if you were a participant in one of the sessions, what struck you about those contributions. So, does anybody want to start?
Hi, I'm Kerry, Chief Delivery Officer at CoClan. So one thing that really struck me was this idea of a lifelong learning fund. Mm-hmm. We have like huge demand for our sort of, it's basically boot camps, career changer boot camps. So it's people who come to us in their 30s and 40s wanting to change career. And there's a huge part, like there's such a demand for their skills, but there's a huge part of them we can't help because they can't afford it or similar. And so yeah, I love that idea. And do you have any thoughts about how we go about making things like that happen?
I mean, I think this is an idea that's been in circulation for quite some time. I think there's a question about the delivery of that, and it may be a question you'd want to put to the funding council later when we have a contribution from them. But there are a number of opportunities there, and I'm really interested in the sort of the Code Clan model as a way of doing things. Can I turn a question back at you? Please don't hesitate to ask any more questions. I won't do this again.
Just me.
I just wondered, how do you consider what you're doing different to what more traditional tertiary education does through either colleges or through universities?
Interesting question. For us, it's about the speed and the intensity. So it's about getting people turned around more quickly into these careers. So it's not about taking a master's for a year or 18 months or a degree for 3 years. It's 14 to 16 weeks and you can be in a new career, and it's a successful model. So for us it's the speed, and it makes it much more practical for somebody to change career if they're only going to have to be out of work for a few months, and they're not trying to juggle job and learning as well. So
yeah, and I think that was one of the themes that really came out, was that there are now skills that you can learn very quickly. And I mean, my own background in innovation, it used to be it would take you 10 years to get somebody through a PhD in aeronautical engineering before they could deliver on something that was innovation in the economy. Whereas some of these much quicker processes allow people to be in innovative jobs and creative jobs much more quickly, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and it's also, because of that speed, we can adapt faster to, technology in particular is a highly, it moves on so fast, so we can be, iterating the curriculum between cohorts and similar, so it can improve, from one group of students to the next. So I think that also helps or is maybe something we're a bit different. Because we're not, maybe it's a bit easier for us than say colleges or universities to change the curriculum.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions or comments that might build on that, or something different? Anything that struck you from the report?
Forgot. Funding might be a difficult one because already, we're short of funds with Skills Development Scotland or the traditional way through for colleges and higher education. So that will be a real challenge, and it's okay for short, sharp programs, but where you're having complete life changes and maybe choice of career, that will take longer. So the funding is something that's got to be considered.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we were all very aware of that, and that was actually something that informed the conception of the report. I think higher education, tertiary education in Scotland has done really well in the era of devolution, and as somebody who has had a look at the Scottish budget through the past 6 months of its inception, things really aren't going to be as easy as they were before, and that means we have to be really smart about what we do. So we want to kind of get ahead of some of those questions and begin to think about how it was we could move forward.
Hi all. Climate was on one of the key themes. I wonder what consideration you'd given to kind of, there's a kind of separation between climate skills, the kind of obvious unlocking greenhouse gas, emissions reductions, but then also the skills that every learner will need going through the tertiary education to be able to operate in 30 years when the economy looks completely different, because net zero is kind of part of of everything we do? Is there kind of consideration of that split?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we talked quite a lot about phased transition. So, you know, if what you want to do is deal with the climate crisis right now, probably the thing you would do is train as an electrical engineer so that you can install an electric car charge point, because there's a desperate need for those, or to do retrofit in housing. But those skills are things that will have to transform over 30 years. And again, that's why we were thinking about this sort of mission or challenge based approach, where you can begin to build those sort of horizontal lines across the downward threads of knowledge that we have at the moment. And I think that's where some of the really interesting stuff might come in future, and that's one of the things that we wanted to infuse the sector with, is this notion of challenges or missions. And you know, I mean, I noticed Keir Starmer making a speech about moving government to a mission-based approach. The Scottish government already has two missions, one around post-COVID and one around net zero. This is an approach that's coming, and it's something that I think the sector needs to get to grips with and to engage with. Now, the way in which we conceive those is really interesting, and it's very formative at the moment. So I think there's a real opportunity to shape that, or maybe to try and transform it into something that might address some of the problems with those approaches.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks very much. I had a question about whether you gave any consideration in terms of regional approaches or kind of collaboration, with it being kind of a big focus of the Scottish government, in addition to kind of like high-level challenges that the whole kind of country faces, and what kind of any particular insights you kind of derive from how collaboration might work regionally or further across.
I think there was. I mean, I don't know. Anne, do you want to take that one here?
Yes, this was actually a key theme that emerged, the importance of collaboration, and there were some great examples, particularly in the northeast, of regional collaborations that were working well. The challenge, I think, that emerged from what the stakeholders told us was, how do you make those scalable and sustainable? Because often these kind of collaborations depend on, you know, great leadership, or, you know, trust built between different institutions, which can be quite sort of person-centered almost. And how do you make those values of collaboration and the greater social good really work? We didn't come up with the answers. We, I think, thought that was a key theme, and we actually took a whole round table on that whole topic, because it was such an important theme, because people talked about collaboration in general and the examples of regional collaboration, and the key role, for example, of colleges in being responsible to regional economic and social issues, challenges, was something that again emerged very strongly. What we didn't get enough, we didn't have enough time or to drill down and come up with a blueprint, but I think the values-based approach, so that the institutions, broadly speaking, were doing this collaboration for purposes of greater good. Some of the funding constraints that we've been hearing about can currently operate against that, but if we're taking a 20-year time window, how do you make sure that those values and those social justice or regional priorities actually trump interinstitutional funding competition?
I think that's one of the things that we discussed a lot, is not, is like how much actually can be waste of funding. The high levels of competition can actually generate a waste of funding, and in this future of issues with funding that we all know that is coming in terms of the funding for providers, how actually should be a starting point for higher levels of collaboration that would maximize education. So I think that, hopefully, when we see the changes in funding and the budget, that would lead to more collaboration instead of more competition, because there is a chance that can go any other way.
And I think it's also worth saying that where Scotland performs really, really well on higher education research and development, hard, it performs relatively poorly on BARD, the business enterprise research and development. And I think some of the key to that is in regional approaches, because once you get the agglomeration effects that come with local economies, then you get a synergy between colleges, universities, and businesses, and you begin to build that additional source of funding. And I think that might be one of the answers to the questions around funding, is to have really successful regional economies. And I think I'm really interested in the Edinburgh approach around data, for instance, which I think might begin to generate some of those agglomeration effects that could really be transformative, and I think that's an important aspect of where we go in future. And it's interesting that the examples of good practice are in the Northeast, where we have had that sort of agglomeration effect and a regional economy effect, and I think that drives up some of those business research and development opportunities. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There will be more opportunity to ask questions after that.
Any observations to what the class struck you most clearly? So the question was, what struck you most about the contributions from the parts that you were able to participate in?
So in the first place, I think one of the things that struck me most was how much more we need to keep having conversations, very inclusive conversations, about the purpose and the value of tertiary education for different stakeholders. And maybe this is the cynical lecturer in me talking now, but a lot of those conversations are held outside academia by politicians and the press. That's one challenge. When they're held within academia or within the college sector, within the tertiary education sector, they're often held by management who actually have, it's a long time since some of them have been at the coalface, right? But really, these conversations, iterative conversations about the value, the changing value and purpose that different people see, the personal value, the local value, the economic value, the societal value, the national and the global value of different aspects of tertiary education. I think it's very, very important that we keep having those conversations. I think one of the things that has struck me about this process has been in the last decade or more, we have absolutely in tertiary education seen a move from teaching knowledge to teaching skills, and increasingly in our project, the conversation has also been about values, about the role that tertiary education plays in enshrining, embedding, generating values. And again, I think we need some more conversation, more inclusive conversation about whose values. Value-based teaching is potentially more contentious, but it's also potentially incredibly important for things like world peace and responsible debate. And if we do have more mature and more inclusive conversations about the values that we are embedding within the different aspects of our curricula, then we actually can take a more ethical approach to some of our collaborations. We can take a more ethical approach to some of our business collaborations, but also some of our international collaborations. If we, within Scotland or beyond, have more conversations where we kind of agree on the set of values that our tertiary education sector enshrines, then those can be a benchmark when we start taking money from states that commit human rights abuses, for example. And we don't hold those kinds of people to account often enough. One of the other things that really came out, not just from the report, but from the responses in January, I think, is that there is a real question, isn't there, about development of curriculum and about a kind of shift in what we think of as core and what we think of as extra, and what the tertiary education sector really ought to take core responsibility for, and what are incidental or optional or maybe privileged parts of learning. So there are, in the kind of market-driven, sort of competition-driven sector right now, there are lots of initiatives that different colleges and universities are sort of importing and kick-starting that kind of add value to the tertiary education experience for their learners. But of course, they come with a huge workload commitment for learners as well as for the staff who are delivering them. And again, I think there's more conversation to be had about what we see as core, what we see as additional, and who's included, who has access to some of that additional stuff.
And I mean, I think one of the things we were trying to do here was a co-production exercise between the different stakeholders who are engaged in tertiary education in its broadest extent, to try and shape that future. And I hope that that's been successful, and I'm really pleased to see you all here today. Can you answer the same question? So what was the thing that struck you most about the experience of attending all of these roundtables?
Well, there was one comment in our international roundtable that stayed with me. We had somebody there from the World Bank, and their job was to argue for investment in states across the world in tertiary education. And some of these states, of course, are low and middle income, and they had to make the case for why you should invest in tertiary education rather than in primary medical care. And of course, we all know that those debates happen everywhere, but somehow that very blunt, that this woman literally goes into meetings to argue for investments in tertiary education as opposed to rolling out, I don't know, inoculation programs in rural areas. And that really brought back, I think, what Alice is talking about what is the true societal value of tertiary education. And the other sort of related part of that was this notion of co-production. Because again, I'm quite interested because I chair UNESCO in the UK, and they've been involved in a lot of debate about higher education in globally, and there's a lot in that debate about the co-production of the curriculum, about decolonising the curriculum, but really involving a wide range of stakeholders and what should be learned and what values should be learned. And some of those themes also emerged in our much more Scottish-focused discussions. So it was that synergy between what's happening in international debates about tertiary education, about values, about ownership, about co-production, and what that means for regional collaborations. So, I mean, it was that resonance that really encouraged me. It wasn't two very different discussions.
And I mean, I think one of the interesting things for me about it is that I think tertiary education is the place at which we get people into the position where they can become full co-producers of knowledge, of society, where we give people that final set of skills that they need to participate either in the workforce or as citizens. And I think that's one of the things that we focused on in the report. So I mean, Alice, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about those areas where we're really taking people and turning them into citizens who can either contribute economically or can contribute democratically or creatively or however else.
Yeah, so one of the early conversations we had included Carl Gombrich at the London Interdisciplinary School, and it was really, really interesting to hear about his conception of tertiary education as learning to do work of value to others. And I think that's a strapline that I've often kind of come back to at times when I've been sort of designing courses or talking to my students, and actually it has got me doing a lot more citizen scholarship with my students. What happens when you do that, when you are kind of exploiting that porous relationship between study and society, is you're immediately equipping students with skills that they don't get from pure study, but you're also kind of enthusing them and empowering them and enabling them to see where they can take this learning, what applications it might have. And they become very much more co-creators, co-producers of their own learning journey, and really empowered actually to take, I teach Roman history, but we do applied classics, right? And that's quite a hard sell. But actually to apply material from antiquity to kind of contemporary problems, it's something that lights their fire. So that has been really interesting, learning more about citizen scholarship, about mission-oriented learning. Of course, that does bring us back to conversations about interdisciplinarity. obviously we've seen the pandemic where actually it wasn't simply science that was brought in to try and address the pandemic. When you think about peace building in the world, it's not simply technology, there are social sciences, there are humanities involved. So a lot of lip service gets paid to interdisciplinarity in our sector. There are lots of barriers to it. But I think we also need to keep having conversations about disciplinarity and about expertise itself, right? What does expertise look like going forward? So traditionally, universities, in particular, have been kind of gatekeepers and have sort of had a monopoly almost on producing so-called expertise, authenticating it, legitimizing it. And I think we're quite a way past that era, but we haven't yet recognized how to bring different kinds of expertise by experience, for example, into the learning space. And I think mission-oriented learning, citizen scholarship, is one of the ways in which we can actually crack some of the challenges around interdisciplinarity and the sort of but the tension between, all interdisciplinary teams need specialism. But we need to think more broadly about what specialism looks like and what expertise we want to admit, we want to authenticate and embrace. And different parts of the tertiary education sector have so much to learn from each other about this. Because there are parts way beyond the university sector that think harder about this than the universities themselves.
So about 5 years ago now, I was part of a report called The Future of Work when I was at Nesta, and we produced the report at the same time as the IPPR. Our great rivals produced a report. IPPR said we're going to destroy, I think it was 40% of jobs. IPPR were, of course, incorrect. What our modelling suggested was that we would continue to have the same number of jobs, but we would drive them up the value scale. So instead of jobs being destroyed, what was going to happen is that jobs were going to become more skilled. And that's been something that I think has been quite decisive for me in my thinking about things in relation to this report. And of course, just at the conclusion point of the report, people started playing around with the AI tool ChatGPT, which is an interesting. I've been trying to write something on it, and I'd kind of been toying with the idea in my head of putting the question into ChatGPT and just asking it to write it for me, and seeing whether it would make any sense. So I think there's a really interesting question there about the interaction between technology, innovation, and the jobs of the future, because the jobs of the future are not going to be destroyed by ChatGPT. It's going to be about how you use those tools, and I think that's been a really significant thing for us coming out of this. Is that it's not that we're entering a future of no work. We're entering a future of more skilled work and probably more human work as well. So the things that you can't automate are the things that are going to be of value. So I don't know if you'd had any reflections.
Just to add into that, there's some research that came out just yesterday actually that shows that not only, so AI and digital, early research is showing not only that it requires more skilled work, but it also requires more monotonous work. That research teams where robots have been running experiments, for example, the researchers have had to spend more time cleaning the equipment, checking the equipment, programming the equipment, and doing work actually that is very monotonous, quite hard labor, that was totally unexpected, and their workload has actually gone up. So it is certainly not cutting work in all sectors.
I think one of the things that really struck me about the report was this notion of co-production, and it's really that point that Alice was making about expertise, because the whole reason those of us in tertiary education feel that we write the curriculum is because we are the experts. So how do we get genuine co-production of a curriculum in a way that, bridges don't fall down, surgery doesn't go horribly wrong. There is expertise. So how do you combine expertise with ownership and co-production? And that strikes me as a really interesting and challenging theme going forward that I don't think our workshops came up with an answer, but it strikes me that if you think of what would be the biggest challenge for the sector going forward, I think that whole co-production would be quite high up there. I think we have a long way to go on learner-centeredness and flexibility, but I could kind of see how we would make the steps, and there would be funding constraints and there would be other things, but you could see how you would solve them. But genuine and meaningful co-production is, I think, a really exciting and very challenging question for the sector.
I mean, I think one of the things about co-production is that you can very often recognise it if you're a part of it, but it's very difficult to work out how you would achieve that and how you can build it into systems. And I don't know, Alice, if you had any reflections on the ways in which you've been able to do that in your sort of citizen learning and changing your approach to I mean, what I think we maybe need to move away from calling teaching, because that has a one-directional flavour to it. But I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that.
So my personal experience has been that it is an experiment in progress. And so what do you need to roll that out and to scale up the experiment? Well, you need resources, and that's time, not just money. And you need support networks as well. So one of the ways in which I've developed more citizen scholarship courses is through a kind of model of learning which is at several Scottish universities now and colleges as well, which is called the VIP, the Vertically Integrated Project. And that involves students from first year all the way through to postgraduate level, working together in a team. Taking ownership of the research questions they want to ask within a particular topic. So I run one on visualizing peace, and thinking very much about both a mix of research and outputs and outcomes to that research. So they set their own research goals. Now it's only because I'm in an institution where there is that flexibility, where there's been some resource, not enough resource thrown at that kind of experimental teaching model that enables students and staff to learn alongside each other. And I think there are real challenges going ahead. So one of the great responses which I enjoyed from the January consultation was, we haven't heard enough about the role and identity of lecturers, and I think that is right. Just in the space of 5 years, so I've got 3 children, and at one point I went on maternity leave, I had a couple of years of research leave, and then went on maternity leave again. So I had a 4-year gap between teaching. My job radically changed in that time. The time it takes someone to do a PhD, the time it takes someone to get through an undergraduate degree, or a college degree, in that short space of time, the student's job description has changed. The expectations of the wider world and of the sector have changed. So in some ways we're in a very kind of we're in an environment where everyone's running to keep up, and so space needs to be made for staff and students to reflect, to upskill, share expertise, share best practice. And actually one of the things that's really fantastic about the VIP model is that there is a lot of cross-college, cross-institution sharing, and so there is a lot of learning between Stirling University, for example, and other places. So time, resource, mentoring, training, that gives students and staff the space to reflect on where they're going and kind of have this experimental learning journey together.
I think one of the things that was really interesting about a lot of this was we talked a lot about partnerships, and partnerships require both sides to be willing to partner. You can't have a partnership with somebody who doesn't want to be your partner. And I wondered, Anne, if you could reflect a little bit on who those partners should be and how it is we can get them engaged in this process so that they become willing partners in that partnership, because to co-produce things with people, you have to have willingness on both sides.
And I think we have some examples of how that works between colleges and universities, not everywhere and not without challenges. I think it's much, and we had some really interesting discussion about the work in Dundee around the Michelin Centre, where there was a wider range of partners, perhaps not the usual suspects, university, colleges, employers, local authorities, but how do you involve students in those partnerships? How do you involve communities in those partnerships? We did not come across as yet examples of how that's done. And if we're genuinely going to have education, tertiary education that has real value economically and socially, you need that broader set of stakeholders. It does take time and space. It does take trust, time and space, relationship building. We kind of all know how to do it, but it isn't easy, and it isn't easy to sustain. So in a sense, scalability, sustainability around the whole notion of a multi-stakeholder partnership, I think would at the best be described as a work in progress or some interesting exemplars, but we don't have a system-wide approach, which is probably what we need. But I'd be really keen to hear from people in the room on that, because they may well have examples that we don't know about yet.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to contribute from the room, it's like a baton.
Hi there. I immediately think of the necessity to deliver ESOL classes just now to Ukrainians. I think that's created in a very short space of time. We've had to see the creation of partnership approaches to English delivery, whose first language isn't English. So partners who would maybe take a long time to come together across local councils, further education, housing associations, very, very quickly in a short space of time we've had to see that. There has been no other option. So maybe we could look to examples of accelerated development such as those.
I mean, I think it was really striking during the pandemic that there was rapid innovation in response to a crisis, like, as you say, the arrival of lots of Ukrainian people who need support in the community. And it's a shame that it's a crisis that takes that kind of risk. There is a lot of risk to rapid experimental collaboration. And I think maybe we are too risk averse. But yeah, so that's another example, just the pandemic, that where suddenly all sorts of innovations started happening, but all sorts of collaborations between groups who wouldn't normally have worked together.
And I mean, I just want to give kind of another plug for a sort of challenge-based approach, which is the aim of a challenge-based approach is to identify what those things are, to create that space where you don't have a catastrophe, but you do have something that really needs to be solved very rapidly, where there's a clear need to work across sectors or across disciplines. And I would hope if we could adopt that sort of approach, that could be really helpful. We'll come here and then.
Hi. It's working, yeah. That strikes me as germane to the point you've just made, Peter, is under the section unresolved tensions. In your forward look, and that's just a shorthand term for your report, how are we going to address this really the corrosive societal impact of social media is having across the piece on having civilized debate in society? And to what extent do you see a role for tertiary education, in a sense, bringing back some of these values that we have to have a proper civilized debate about important issues? Because the toxicity of social media is just so rampant at the moment, is that it's difficult to see a way forward. So could we spend a little bit of time talking about that?
You got the right people. Sorry, we turned to each other and grinned because we've been working on a responsible debate charter for the past 5 years. Myself and Alice and a couple of other colleagues from the Young Academy. So we have been doing some work in that area, and I think I was actually talking to Sandra just before the event about the nature of social media and what that means for our public sphere, and how and good citizenship, and I think it's deeply problematic, but I think that's to do with some of the drivers behind social media, and I think we need to find ways. Really interestingly, we had a guy involved in our project who had his own company designed to help people debate more appropriately. That company went out of business. Meanwhile, Twitter went for whatever it was, 46 billion in order to promote, I think, very confrontational speech, and I think that marks some of the problems. But Alice, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, as Peter says, responsible debate is a huge societal challenge, and it's not just happening. It's not just a problem on social media. In some ways, social media is a mirror as well as a driver to what's happening in wider society. And I think this brings us back to the question about values. One of the interesting conversations we had around that in one of our roundtables was to what extent is tertiary education responsible for teaching leadership, teaching ethical leadership? And I think that is arguably a very important role of all areas of tertiary education. The toxic debate that we see in society is a symptom of other bad behaviours. Actually, it's one of several bad behaviours, but it's underpinned sometimes by dishonesty. Now, in an education space, and this is true right from primary all the way through to tertiary education. In an education space, one of the things that you can keep coming back to is evidence-based discussion, as a counter to fake news, for example, and also to finding respectful, responsible, ethical ways of disagreeing with each other, of finding common ground and finding shared purpose. And again, this connects up with mission-oriented learning. On any issue, most of us can find some common ground, right? You might disagree vehemently with someone about whether or not Scotland should become independent, but actually, ultimately, both of you are concerned with living a secure, stable, economically okay life, and working back from there. So mission-oriented learning, where you identify actually what's the mission, and then you work out how to work cross-sector, cross-discipline, cross-expertise on that, where you embrace different kinds of expertise and include expertise by experience and so on. All of that, all of those educational practices can really improve responsible debate and be a counterbalance to the toxicity that we see. Now, it's not going to solve everything, but I think this is one of the.
But could that include a return to some things, earlier classical types of training that was prevalent in many generations in the arts of rhetoric?
Sorry.
Discussion, because
just.
If you can cancel people.
Just for those online, that was a question about whether we could introduce some of the characteristics of classical education, and then I want to come to the person behind, if that's okay. So
very briefly, as a classicist, an awful lot of ancient rhetoric is terribly combative, and arguably, where the problem started. But I think, Peter and I would probably argue that every education sector ought to run some micro-credential courses on responsible debate, and, that's it.
And if you want us to run those, please do come and let us know. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Raffaello Gone. I'm an engineer, and I think that one of the issues, which I very much agree with everything which has been said about values, and creating innovation within the curriculum. There are stakeholders who are the professional bodies. And I think in engineering it's extremely important that those are on board. Very often we cannot make many changes into our curriculum simply because otherwise we don't get accreditation. And if you don't get accreditation, you cannot become a chartered engineer. So I think that it's important for innovation and for technological innovation to have those bodies on board as well. And although there is a lot of emphasis on responsible technologies, ethics in engineering, I do think that there is not enough in our curricula. And personally, I'm also acting as an external examiner for other universities, big ones, Russell's group, and small ones, we all face the same problem. So I think that something has to be done at that level as well.
I absolutely agree that there are stakeholders, and professional bodies are a key group that we need to reach out to. One thing that emerged from our discussion, and it is the values point, is whether within the 3-year, 4-year college or university curriculum, having all the ethics and the responsibility things kind of shoehorned in is the most effective model, or whether the greater flexibility, thinking about training over a longer, or education over a longer period, might be a better way of inculcating those values. But the professional bodies absolutely need to be on board. And there is a real question, as I said, of expertise. You know, none of us want failures in our bridges. None of us want our gas boilers to explode. So, you know, there are real pieces of expertise that need to be protected. But how do we do it in a way that has this broader philosophy behind it?
Personally, I don't think that we need a longer degree. We need to embed ethics from year one, and you can have ethical issues even in mathematics, in teaching mathematics. We teach our students that there is one solution. There is never one solution in engineering. So I think that's something that we have. It's just the forma mentis that has to change, which requires long time, lot of effort, and very often lecturers do not have the time to do that because they are under other pressures, CREF. And I think the professional body should be on board just to make those changes.
Thanks. I think that's a really helpful suggestion. And I think one of the interesting things for me about this, and I think where one of the areas we really didn't approach was around media and how people can be engaged through media in some of these discussions outside of formal education, but through formal education. Champers Alice has a really excellent podcast to go with to go with our course that is one of the ways that we might do that. But I think one of the things, I mean, to go back to the previous question, I think there's a really interesting point about people's ability to evaluate evidence in a way that allows them to understand what's happening. And you know, we had a lot of really great stuff during the COVID crisis around this. We had some really, really terrible stuff with the use and abuse of statistics in the public sphere. And I found that really interesting. And I think the more we use the opportunities through media and new media to try and help people to hone their skills in these areas, the better that is. And that might be statistical skills for people who don't come from that background. It might be ethical skills for people who come from an engineering background, a mathematical background.
Yes, I think one of the things that I've learnt from doing a bit more co-production with students is that they open up different media and different audiences. And so the learning spreads actually beyond the boundary of the institution you're in or the bubble that you're in, and we are all in our own bubbles. So actually involving students in identifying target audiences for whatever research they're doing or whatever study they're engaged in can be really, really productive. And as a researcher with 20 years experience, I've been suddenly, as a result of my students, been asked to talk to completely different stakeholders and different groups of people because of the work that they've been doing together with me and with the team to get the research speaking to different people and to different issues, and it's a very exciting space to be in.
Yeah, and I think we're in our last minute, so I don't know if you wanted to make any concluding remarks.
I mean, we are trying to stimulate the debate. We do not have all the answers. We do have some themes that are emerging that I think are important ones, and hearing from you has been great. Please keep reacting, please keep feeding back to us, because this is exactly what the whole project was about, not about definitive answers, but raising the kind of questions that we've been hearing about. We've now got the opportunity to hear from 3 experts in tertiary education. Very briefly, I'm afraid, because time is not on our side. We're trying to cram in a lot, but I'm delighted to welcome Marielle Bruce from YouthLink Scotland, Eve Lewis from Sparks, and online we have James Dunphy from Scottish Funding Council, and they're all going to give us brief reactions from the perspective of their organisation to some of the themes, etc., that are emerging from the report. Marielle, you're up first, I think. Thank you so much. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm slightly anxious about being introduced as an expert, but we'll see. My name is Marielle. I'm the Youth Work and Skills Manager at YouthLink Scotland, and I struggled a wee bit with trying to think out what is it I want to share with you this afternoon. So yes, absolutely some reflections on this really useful report from a youth work sector perspective, but also maybe to share with you some of the conversations and questions we've been having as a sector around the future of education, the future of post-school education, and kind of youth work's role within that. So tiny little bit of context first for those of you who are sitting here thinking, what's youth work and why are they part of this discussion? So youth work's part of community learning and development. So community learning and development is that professional practice that incorporates adult learning, family learning, community capacity building and youth work. So within that family, youth work is about, it's an education practice that supports the social, personal and educational development of children and young people. It's a real lifelong learning approach, so actually youth workers engage with young people across that whole learner journey with particular relevance at those transition points, so young people moving from primary into secondary and some of the work that you're all involved in. It's a rights-based approach, so we work with all young people, but have a particular role and expertise for young people impacted by poverty. Some of those students that we'll be thinking about in terms of what the report's saying around widening access. So within that context, the two things that struck me most within the report was around learner-centredness and collaboration. So young people, as part of the national discussion on education, told us some quite clear things. That youth work is part of education. It's an integral part of their education. And that education should help them to prepare for life and work. So I was interested in the phrase that came out of the report talking about learners going to want tertiary education to prepare them to, what was the phrase, work anywhere in the world. So for me, I'm thinking, what's the interface there between what our young people are telling us and young people in that tertiary education experience? At what point actually do they now not need us to be preparing them for the world of for life as much as for the world of work? So within the work that we did around the national discussion, 22% of young people told us that they were getting what they needed across all the places where they learned. So these were young people that were at school, college or university, or had moved into the workplace. They were all either engaging with youth work or had engaged with youth work, and only 22% of them said absolutely we're ticking all the boxes. Some of what they told us in addition to that was, yes, so we need our education experience to prepare us for life and for work. What needs to change in order to do that? We understand that qualifications are really important. I would argue that they've said that because the system tells them that they need qualifications to get to college and university and to get a job. But alongside those qualifications, they said, actually, we need experiences as part of education that help us to develop and to try out and test life-relevant skills. So skills that we feel are relevant for our lives, but also relevant for work. Some of the other things they said they needed from us as educators was to feel safe, respected, included and heard in the places where they learn and by the people who support their learning. Reflecting again one of the findings that came through this report, young people telling us that they need their education to support an individualised journey, to support lots of different options and pathways, and to demonstrate to them that they're equally valuable. So we asked young people particularly about the skills that they develop through youth work. So we've been on a bit of a skills journey with our sector, making sure that young people taking part in youth work, either as part of their curriculum experience or at different parts and different contexts, not only develop skills but understand the relevance of those skills for their future world of work and life and the different pathways. So they said to us, actually the skills that we're developing through youth work are more important or just important to us as the other things that we learn through school and college and university. 88% of young people telling us that they wanted the education system to recognise and celebrate those skills and achievements alongside other qualifications. They also told us that they wanted, most of the young people use the term teachers and youth workers because, if I'm honest, the majority of respondents were still at school, but wanted us to collaborate better as educators. So for me, as a youth worker, that informs what I think about, how do we as a sector need to respond to that over the next kind of 20 years, but also what is our role as practitioners who advocate on behalf of young people for whom the system generally isn't working. So the second point then, it was around collaboration. So my day job is around the Scottish Attainment Challenge, so really thinking about how we can best support learners who are impacted by poverty. I don't think I pick up a single piece of national policy at the moment and don't see the word collaboration in it. So I think we're absolutely getting it, and at grassroots level, most people sort of get it. But what I took from the TEF report was that there's lots of enablers, but there's also lots of barriers, and it's about unpicking some of those challenges. So absolutely, in terms of education, in terms of youth work and those kind of partnerships between schools and youth work or colleges and youth work, yeah, we absolutely understand that there's these key characteristics about an effective collaboration. We know that it's really good that we've got this shared values, shared language, a common understanding, that we've reached this point where we've got these relationships based on mutual trust and respect. And I could reel off a huge list, as I'm sure you could, of really effective partnerships that are supporting young people at transition points. They're creating lots of different pathways. And yeah, we can tick off all those boxes, but there's something within the system that's preventing this. And I'm reflecting, as I'm hearing the conversations today, about what some of that might be. For me, it's that power imbalance that, and I don't know how we get away from it. I'm sitting here and I actually feel, gosh, I'm a youth worker and amongst lots of academics and professionals, so actually if we were going to collaborate, I would say that you had a little bit more power. If I'm going to work alongside young people, even though I'm a youth worker and we work in partnership, there's that kind of implied power imbalance there. So no matter what kind of conversations we have as a wider education sector between professionals, there's always going to be that kind of unsaid thing about power. What we've seen recently is sometimes when youth work brings investment to the table, that shifts that power balance. So my argument would be, like some of the points that have been raised before, how can we ever hope to reach that point of genuine collaboration when there's not equal investment across the system? So lastly, I suppose, and I flip between, are these opportunities, are these challenges? So the challenge for us as a sector is to reimagine and future-proof youth work as part of education and think about what does that mean for us, whilst also holding true to the unique purpose and pedagogy of youth work. So I'm sitting here telling you that absolutely we're part of the education system. We're less confident about our role as part of the post-school education, I'll be honest about that. But I'm part of the system. But I'm also here advocating for young people, trying to challenge this system that isn't working for the majority of young people. So how do I do that in a way that kind of keeps me authentic? How do I follow what young people are telling us and the world's telling us about the future of skills and still deliver that in a non-formal way that puts young people at the heart of it and that we co-construct our curriculum? Maybe the opportunity is being given to us by young people. Maybe what young people are asking of us is to all become change makers, and actually to think about our individual agency, or the agency that we have as institutions now, and not to be too focused on what's this going to look like in 20, 30 years. There are young people that are part of our education system right now that need us to deliver what they need. So maybe what I've taken from this most is, can we all be change makers, and can we look at what we could do differently now, thinking about some of those themes that are coming out of the report, and make the changes around learner-centredness and collaboration that young people are calling for. Thank you.
That was fabulous, Marielle. So many things I want to follow up on, but time is against us. There will be time for question and answers at the end. But can I turn now to Eve Lewis, Director of Sparks? Thank you, Eve.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for having me along to speak today. What I thought I'd do is tell you a little bit about Sparks and sort of set that in context of why I've been asked to speak today. And then there was some themes I wanted to pick up through the report. So I wanted to talk about the setting, so the setting that the report gives us, and how that reflects on some of the work that we do. And wanted to also to talk about what we mean by learner-centredness and how that reflects into some of our work, and talk about partnership, but in particular talking about partnerships with students, which obviously links into that learner-centredness. So the first thing is, what is Sparks and what did we do? So Sparks is student partnerships in Quality Scotland. So we're very much around developing the quality of the student learning experience. We talk about our mission, our vision, being around supporting students to be able to shape their learning. And we talk about that in terms of students being able to shape their learning from themselves individually and collectively, and for that to be however and wherever they learn. About 5 years ago, we changed our mission from in colleges and universities to however and wherever they learn. And that's one of the interesting things for us. It's been a thing that we try to do, and then within our work, and certainly prior to the pandemic, we were trying to do work with people like training providers, in schools, in different settings. But to be honest, the majority of our work still sits within colleges and universities. But we do work across that sort of tertiary environment, and we work with learners that might be in college from school, right through to people doing a PhD, so apprentices. So there is a complexity of the learners that we work with, but we're not working in every setting. Okay, so what I wanted to do, the report for me captures that a complexity and the rate of change and the pace of change and all of those things that are going on in the environment. And it made me think about one of the things that we do when we're talking to students. So we talk to students about how you change learning and why they should be involved in their education. So, now, luckily, I didn't see this report before it was published, but you've got like paper aeroplanes on the front of your report, and we use aeroplanes and forms of transport as well, so there's a real synergy there. So we talk about students and their role in these different ways. So, and we have this conversation regularly with them. So one of the roles of students being involved in their education and having a voice is at that point where we're talking about stopping the aeroplane falling out of the sky. So really making sure we've got those things in place that makes education work for the individual students and gets from A to B. One of the other things that we talk about, though, is that's just not the end. So the work that we do with students isn't about just making sure it flies and doesn't fall out of the sky. And I suppose also that they get through, but they turn out the other end able to be a surgeon or be a hairdresser. We don't just concentrate on that. We talk about how you enhance it and you make different forms of different types of experiences for different people. And so the plane analogy we use lots of the times around how you can shape individual experiences and how you can have different experiences that suit different people. And lots of our work over the years has helped us do that. So there's lots of systems in place to support different forms of transport to go in different places and to do different things for different people. And I think we have a confident, and then we were also tested during the pandemic, that we're confident we had systems in place that actually when we worked with students, it stopped it falling out of the sky as well. We got through that. I suppose one of the things about the report, and also around my understanding of the world in which we live, is that we're actually now in an opportunity to design not an aeroplane that does it differently, has got bigger, comfier seats, but we've actually got an opportunity to design something brand new. That's the space rocket. So we have that idea that we are at the precipice of doing something different and something new. But where do we have those systems in place to bring students and to bring the work that we're doing with them into that discussion to really design something that's different for the future? So there's an ambition there, but I think one of the challenges for us and what the report sets out is, do we have those structures in place to do that and to really make that something different for the future? Okay. The other thing in terms of the context that I just wanted to talk about was, for us at the moment, we're talking about the future with students, and they've got loads to say and lots of exciting things to talk about, but some of the stuff around cost of living is the first thing that they think about. And just to set that in the realism of what life is like currently, that is all consuming a lot for the students that we live with. I've drawn your attention to, it's an NUS report, and they've done lots of work in terms of cost of living and the effects on students, and there's loads more detail in that report. But the ones I've picked out here are the ones that are specifically about the learning experience. So it's not just about whether or not we keep students safe and they've got somewhere to live, and is it our role to look after their mental health, or is it somebody else's role to do that? But the things we do and the way we design our learning and teaching actually has a direct effect on them and on their ability to develop and succeed. So just in terms of all that complexity, this is a real thing that we need to keep sight of. Okay, so that's all the stuff about the setting. Then I wanted to talk about learner-centeredness. So I think one of the things about learner-centeredness is, like, we can't argue with it. Everybody thinks that we obviously do things because we want things to be the best they can be for students. My colleague, I was just going through this with her earlier, and she was saying the thing she always uses is RSPB care about birds. Of course they do, but they don't work in partnership with birds to make things happen. And so that's one of the things that I think is really important. We all care about students, and we want to do, there's not many people I work with in my work don't want to do the very best for our learners, but it's not about doing it to them. It's about how we work with them and how we develop that. Okay, so I'm going to we do that, that's part of our work, and how we go about developing things. So these students designing and co-creating not just their curriculum, but their student learning experience is fundamental to how we work. And we've started a piece of work across Scotland, so we've been commissioned by the Scottish Funding Council to try and design with students some key principles about what makes an excellent learning experience. So we started with these blocks, and we got these blocks out of a scan of all the literature and what's out there about what makes perfect learning experience and stuff. We started with these blocks, and then we started to do some research with students. So our aim is to develop a framework with students that says what are the key principles in all of these areas that they want to see from their education. These are the types of students we worked with, so it's really important that we did work that was inclusive. I'll say that they were all based in a college or university. That's our way of getting to them. But we have worked with apprentices, and we have worked with diverse groups of students. We've worked with students with additional support needs, and we've worked with postgraduate research students. So all that, and all the intersectionalities that come within that. So big range of students across the tertiary sector. And one of the things, we work with students in that environment, and they come together and they can come up with things that are common across that sector, and they've started to do that. We're at the early stages, so we've worked with about 300 students in these things. We're at the early stages of bringing out some principles from it. Okay, This is one set of principles. The only reason I've picked this is it's really short. So I've picked the ones for curriculum because these were some of the first draft principles that students came up with. We have pages and pages of principles that they've come up with that we need to now work with and work with the sector. I suppose what it gives you, and I hope it gives you, for every one of those building blocks we've got, this is the shortest one, they've come together across that range of learning experiences, and they're starting to bring together a really rich environment about what matters to them and what those key principles should be. So when we're talking about learner-centeredness, this is their work, this is them saying where they want to come from. If I think about the good news is, a lot of what's in the report is also reflected in some of the things that students are saying. So there's loads of synergy between what your report says and some of the things and some and what students are saying, although there's loads and loads of stuff in there. I just wanted to bring through a couple of things that I wanted to pull out, and I think other speakers have done that. Clearly, it comes out of our work from this and from lots of the conversations that we have with students about this idea of flexibility, of navigating your own journey and being able to move through different journeys in your own place at your own time. And that's a really strong thing that comes through students. One of the things I would like to emphasize is students talk about an individualized approach. They want to be able to navigate that personal journey. But it's really careful to distinguish that from the idea of students being individualistic. And that is not our experience when we're working with students. So those themes that are in the report around their understanding and their beliefs in social justice, inequalities, in the environment, they are something that's like rooted at the core of their experience, and they want it now. Like, it's not a future thing, it's around this is what we expect from our education, and it's incorporated into everything that they're saying. Within that, I think there's some things perhaps that come through some of the work that we do with students around they want individualized approaches, but they also really value feelings of belonging. So belonging is a term that we use an awful lot in our work. So that idea of belonging, being part of a community, where they share the academic community, but also the social community and the responsibility they have to each other and to the world. And that comes through in lots of the work that we're doing with them. So that idea about mental health, well-being, belonging, equality and diversity, and socialization social justice doesn't sit opposed to that individual approach. It's part of it, and their understanding of that to work for everybody is great. And I think one of the other things I want to say into that is the other bit of the thing that we talk about, and we're talking about it so much at the moment, is around digital education. So digital stuff, it's important, it's where we've just gone through the pandemic, we suddenly realised all of this work around digital education. The students generally, when we're doing this work with them, they don't separate that out. Digital education isn't a different thing. They see it as part of this whole picture. So digital is just a tool, it's an enabler or a disabler in terms of some of these things that they're talking about in terms of individualized journeys opposed to belonging, equality and diversity. So the things that digitalization has done for us in terms of accessing education, but also the dangers that might present to us. So that idea of balancing those things is really important. Okay. So that's the sort of work, that's where we're going, and how we want to, and how the report, what we do and how that reflects with students. The last thing I just wanted to touch on is this idea of partnership and collaboration. I'm mainly talking here about our work with students, so how we collaborate with students and how we get them to be part of this journey, how we get them to be part of designing that new form of transport that takes us to the stars and the moon or wherever it is, or through different dimensions or whatever it is we're doing. Okay, so one of the things that we do an awful lot of work with is really investigating and thinking hard about how we work with the students that are part of this journey. And we have lots of different tools, actually, where we talk about what is partnership. How do we work in partnership with students? One of the things that in this model that we're developing, again, we've been commissioned from the Funding Council to try and come up with some shared understanding about how partnership works with students. But one of the things you'll notice is getting feedback from students, asking them what they think is outside of the model. So it's only like, we ask students what we think and we want them to be involved in designing, but just asking them what they think is not partnership with them. So that role of how you get students involved in partnership activities, which is again different from consulting. So we can ask them what we think, we can go away and think of some solutions and get them to talk to us about whether they like our solutions. But some of the ways in which we need to work is not as asking them an opinion, not asking them to contribute to our process, not consulting with them, but really sitting down with them from the beginning to help design, help define the issue and help design the solutions. And one of the challenges I think for us is how we create the capacity with students to play that role, as well as the capacity within the sector to understand that role and to hear those voices strongly.
Thank you, Eve, and that was fascinating to hear the work you're doing, in effect unpacking some of the themes that we touch on in the report. Our final speaker in this session is James Dunphy, Director of Access, Learning and Outcomes at the Scottish Funding Council, and James will be joining us on the screen. Thank you, James.
It's a real pleasure to be with you, and I've really enjoyed reading both the report but also listening to the questions and the conversation today. I've had the pleasure of working in our tertiary system over the last 20 years, having been involved in various ways and in different roles with NUS, SFC, QA, and having spent 15 years as a colleague and also as a board member at Robert Gordon University, where one of my responsibilities was the university's relationships with Scotland's colleges. And since 2020, I've had the great pleasure of being a part of SFC's executive team, working with others to publish our national review and focusing on creating the right funding and regulatory environment which enables institutions to maximise the contributions they can make. It goes without saying, but let me say it now, the work of organisations such as the Royal Society of Edinburgh and indeed the work, Eve, of organisations such as Sparks play a really important role in creating the vibrancy and the richness of our thinking, our policy and our action across the tertiary system. And of course, SFC is delighted to fund both Sparks and RSE to help you to do that work. I was asked this afternoon to give reflections on the tertiary system. Given we are here to mark the final stage of the Tertiary Education Futures project, let me frame the observations that I will make in the context of that report and also in the findings of our own National Review of Tertiary Education and Research. But if I might start with some first principles, which is to be clear. Scotland's tertiary education system, its colleges and universities, are fundamental to the social, economic and environmental well-being of Scotland. In fact, not only Scotland, but far beyond. Not only are they local and national assets, their reach extends across the globe, and together they create a pipeline of skilled and educated people across all levels of technical, vocational and advanced critical thinking requirements. And they offer opportunities to people from all walks of life, including those furthest from the workforce. They help shape local places and communities through the jobs and opportunities they offer and the investments they make. And they act as a lifeline for individuals tackling inequality through widening participation and their excellent discovery research, which catalyses new ideas, breakthroughs and innovations. When you hear all of that, you might wonder why there has been a need to review the tertiary education and research sector. But if we turn the clock back, in fact, turn it back almost to 3 years to the day, it was on the 1st of March 2020 that the first positive case of COVID was reported in Scotland. And we all know and probably want to forget what happened next. 3 weeks later, and the country was in lockdown. colleges, universities, like every other sector, having to pivot rapidly to a set of unprecedented circumstances in order to continue thriving and surviving. And thrive and survive they did, backed by investment and support from government and the Scottish Funding Council. But at the same time, as institutions were responding with speed and agility to the national and indeed international challenge, colleges and universities were also facing huge challenges of their own. The external shock of the COVID pandemic brought into sharp relief challenges that were already there. The increasingly tight fiscal and funding environment, which has been mentioned today, shifting demographics, the impact of automation and artificial intelligence, the changing nature of work, global competition, departure from the EU, changing needs of learners, the climate emergency. The sector certainly didn't have its challenges to seek. And it was against that backdrop that Scottish ministers commissioned the Funding Council to conduct a review of how best we could fulfil our mission of securing coherent provision by post-16 education bodies and the undertaking of research in these changing times. A review that we concluded in June 2021 with the submission of a set of recommendations which ministers approved later that year. Having had the opportunity of receiving an advance copy of the RSE and RSE Young Academy report, I see the very same issues were the drivers for the Tertiary Education Futures project. And what I found even more encouraging were the similarities in the findings from our respective reviews. So let me pick out just a couple of those key themes which I think will be particularly important for the future of tertiary education and research. Firstly, keeping the interests of current and future students and equalities at the heart of everything we do is going to really matter. This was a key recommendation from our review and chimes well with the focus on learner-centredness that comes through strongly in the Tertiary Education Futures report. We know the needs of learners are changing, whether that might be due to their increasingly divergent backgrounds, with an increase, for example, in returners who are looking to upskill or reskill, or whether in response to the other challenges people are facing, such as the cost crisis or the mental health crisis that is sadly rising through the student population. We need to ensure the interests of current and future students are protected and promoted through the development of closer partnership with students, the setting of clear expectations on institutions, and through the development of partnership work at a range of different levels across our system. And we also need to find better ways to support learning through life to enable people to reskill and upskill as the labour market and the future of world of work shifts, and to get credit for that learning by reviewing existing targets, the assumptions that underpin existing funding models, and student support and qualification frameworks. And I'm pleased to say we've already started on this journey post-review. At the end of 2022, we appointed a new Deputy Director for Student Interests, Access and Pathways, who will lead much of our work in this space. We're also delighted to be developing a common tertiary approach to quality assurance and enhancement, building on the excellent quality enhancement framework which has existed in the context of Scotland's universities over these last 2 decades. And just last week we commissioned a project to explore the balance between in-person, online and blended learning to draw in, draw out and help us to maximise the learning that our institutions, learners and indeed staff are bringing to the issue of how it is we focus and maximise opportunities for learning. And we're exploring new approaches to the college funding model, which will enable colleges to respond more flexibly to employer and learner needs, better reflecting the balance between full-time and part-time provision. But both the Tertiary Education Futures report and the SFC also focused on the importance of collaboration, and I want to start my remarks in this space by reminding us that collaboration exists in many forms in the system that we have today. We've heard earlier in the session of the role of professional regulatory and statutory bodies. We've heard about collaboration between learners and educators. That future that we see for tertiary education is a opportunity for further collaboration, which understands that by necessity we have a diverse and complex system, a system that is built on requisite diversity in order to respond to the very different needs of individuals, employers, regional, national and international economies. And that this means we will fund a broad range of provision at all levels, valuing the arts, humanities and social sciences, alongside the drive to improve the uptake of STEM subjects. Diversity also, though, means recognising that individual colleges and universities come in different shapes and sizes, with different missions, ambitions and contributions to make. But equally, we support the following finding from the Tertiary Education Futures report, which is that to ease adaptation and build on the respective strengths of different providers, institutions might move towards a more collaborative system. The focus on a culture of collaboration chimes well with our own recommendation for system change, namely that we should build capacity and a more systematic approach to the way we collectively plan coherent education and skills provision and investment, so that it responds better to the current and future needs of pupils, students, employers and broader economic and social drivers. To take forward this recommendation, we've established 2 regional pathfinders in the north east and the south of Scotland, which through evidence, analysis and collaborative action are exploring in practical ways what further needs to be done to make the education and skills system responsive, integrated and supportive of economic recovery and inclusive growth in each region. And Peter, I thought earlier that chimed well with the comments you made about the contribution the system can make and the benefit the system can derive from regional economic development. We'll use the findings from the Pathfinders to inform potential system improvement and to develop expectations, guidance and good practice for the tertiary education system. But they are also about equipping leaders within the system with the skills, the knowledge and the data sets that will help them themselves to make sure that the provision which we fund, which is delivered through close partnership with many collaborations across our system, are planned and are delivered in ways which work for students and for our economy. Colleagues, I've only touched on 2 key themes which are common across both the RSE work and the work of the Funding Council. Both reviews cover, of course, so much more than that. However, my sense is, and listening to the conversation today, that these 2 key themes, learners at the heart and collaboration, are fundamental to the continuing success of our tertiary sector. We can and should be proud of our tertiary education system. We have much to be grateful for, and we have strong foundations upon which to build. And I have every confidence that through working together, our tertiary education and research system in Scotland will continue to evolve and thrive as we face the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James and Marielle and Eve. Time is against us, but there's time probably to take 1 or 2 questions, if anyone has any in response to the talks that we've just heard. Yeah, Maggie. Yes, it's on its way to you. That would be lovely.
Hi there, I'm Margaret Cunningham from University of Strathclyde. I'm speaking here as a director of our Biomolecular Sciences programme, but also as someone with lived experience of what I could resonate from Marielle's talk, which was this idea of students or learners wanting career experience, job experience. I feel as if sometimes when we talk about tertiary education, there's an elephant in the room whereby apprentices worked, there was a decline in apprentices, and now there's a rise of apprentices. And I was an apprentice 20 years ago, and I recognised that the words that I used to get told was, that career's never going to be for you because it's only for certain trades that we allow progression. So as working and employed in a university, being sent to college on a day release basis over 5 years was transformative to give access, and it's actually really refreshing to see that universities are now valuing the apprenticeship route at that level. So the question I have just now is, how do we remove the stigma associated with what apprentices once were and what they can now become if we reimagine the way in which they can access, with collaboration, with company, with partnership between universities, because 20 years ago that was happening. I was at University of Glasgow, I went to college in Coatbridge, I went to college in Bell College in Hamilton over that 5 years, and it was a perfect partnership, and it allowed me to have the career that I've got today. but it's the mindset and the stigma. So that would be the two things. If there was solutions to problems, how do we think to overcome those?
Thanks. Marielle, Eve, do you want to come in on that?
Is this on?
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of things, isn't it? It's about how we demonstrate parity in order to get over the stigma, and that takes systemic and cultural changes, as you've quite rightly identified. So I would go back to the same old point about investment, so some parity of investment. Stop talking about the system in these component parts, and then I've got a real bugbear just now about language. So I think language is really important. We talk about foundation apprenticeships and, academic. I want to change the language that we use within education. Can we please stop talking about wider achievement, for instance? It's just achievement. Can we stop talking about extracurricular activities? It's just part of the curriculum. So in the same way, if we can one word at a time start to change some of the discourse, then I think we might make some inroads into that.
Thank you. Do you
want I mean, that disparity of esteem is there, and in terms of listening to the stories of students and how they progress through the system, it is about giving those voices and the reality of the experiences. So what you've described as your experience is what you hear all the time from the people who are undertaking these courses. So around how we re-educate, not the students, I think, because I think they understand some of these choices, but parents and the people all around, that we've got a system that does value one or attaches certain prestige. It's not even value, it's a certain prestige to one route over another, and it's about really communicating, I suppose, getting the tertiary education right and those routes, and there's not one way for anybody. Doing an apprentice at one point does not mean that you won't do another point at another, and neither does doing a master's mean that you won't at some point do an apprentice. But really getting those stories from students about how those journeys work and making them work, I think is part of the answer.
Thank you, and I think your point there just takes me back to one of the things I was trying to talk about earlier, which is that there are a lot of people who produce knowledge around higher education who are not part of it, and that's partly the media, and it is partly parents, and the point I made earlier about having more inclusive, mature conversations about what we value in tertiary education and why might be one of the ways to unlock that stigma, to change the language, and I think that's a very, very important point. A last question. I know, I'm sorry, there's so many questions that I'm sure you're all bursting with, but one more, there's time for one more. Go on, be that person who asks the last question. Yes, go for it.
Thanks, I was being polite because I said something earlier, so I thought I would get other people opportunity, but I've got so many questions for each of you. It's really interesting hearing your insights there. I suppose one that I would choose to ask, because it cuts across, is towards the Funding Council's information. It's great to hear these updates and the work that's been done. It's really also great to see in the report the highlighting of the maybe injustice and unequal power between further education and higher education in places, that bleeds through into other stakeholders and organisations and youth and the student body. There are really blatant ones, including the withdrawal of students at HE, funding linked to 4 weeks, whereas in FE it's 9 weeks. There's students will transfer from one college to another college, and that will count as a withdrawal, and the college will lose the money from the 6 months previous contact they've had with that particular student. And so many other examples I could give, but I'm really grateful to see that highlighted here. I think what we'll see is a surfacing of additional examples of that power and injustice that we should be alert to. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And the words power and injustice, I think, are important to bring into the conversation. We did take a decision as part of the process not to dive deep into funding. That has been a source of frustration for us and for all of the people we've collaborated with over the time, because of course funding, as your first question reminded us, is central and is essential, and it has to be part of the conversation going forward. And more creative and more imaginative, but also more just thinking around funding, and I think you brought up the language of power as well. We shouldn't be blind to that. We should absolutely look at that. Do either of you want to say anything in response to that? Yes, you do.
If I can remember what it is I want to say, I can't comment on funding methodology, but we seem to be struggling here. On one hand, we're saying that as a education skill system, we're hearing employers saying that it's the attitudes and aptitudes, it's the transferable skills that we're looking for in young people when they enter the workforce. Yet on the other hand, funding seems to be really directed towards qualifications and completion. And so there's a kind of disparity there for me in terms of what it is that we genuinely value as a system and how that's then kind of funded. And I think that then translates into the point that you made about then what's the message we're sending out there to the wider system and to our students and parents about what's valuable.
And I should say that I'm not ignoring James. He's had to go to a medical appointment. So it's not that I'm not turning that question to him, just because I'm forgetting him. And I think one of the things that your question and other questions in the room have sort of reminded us of is that, and it's something that which the report directly addresses in response to the January roundtable, is that there is a tension between aspiration and reality, between idealism and pragmatism, but they are not binaries, they are a spectrum, right? So there is a spectrum between idealism and pragmatism, and it's pretty good to sit somewhere in the middle of it and not be kind of focused on one end or on another. I think you'll agree with me that we've heard some really, really stimulating reflections in the last hour. Thank you very much again to Eve Lewis, Marielle Bruce, and James Dunphy for joining us. I've taken away some big things there. Education for life, not just for work. It's a silly dichotomy, but we do make it all the time. And so thinking about a holistic education, and the importance of kind of meta-study, reflecting, enabling and mentoring students to reflect around their own learning as part of that process of making it more of a learner-centered experience, listening to student voices and what matters to them, and really understanding what collaboration actually looks like, so that we can lead to more individualized approaches while also preserving that sense of belonging and that sense that they're part of a bigger community, whether that's an institutional community or some other kind of community, not least because that community and that sense of belonging actually does give external value to what they're doing as well as the internal value they derive from it. Change is happening fast. Really, really fast. And I think one of the other things I've taken away from today is that everyone within the sector needs to be given time and support and resource, not to firefight that change, but to think creatively, imaginatively, collaboratively about it. Being change makers now involves actually having the space to think it through and not just react. Talking of change, I think one of the questions that I would like to pose to everyone is, what do we want to keep as well as what do we want to change? And I think that's a report like ours obviously kind of puts a lot of emphasis on what might need to change, what is the new blue sky thinking we could do, but really thinking about what we want to keep as well, what we value and what we already do, I think is valuable. This process has, as Anne said at the start, has been a long process of consultation. But we hope it is actually just a milestone in part of a bigger ongoing conversation. I want to thank Anne for chairing this process expertly, inclusively. It's been a real pleasure to work with you and to be part of it. Thanks also very much to Young Academy colleagues Peter, Sandro, to Carl Leidecker as well on the RSE side, and to the wider working group who've regularly kind of been a place where we can touch base and sense check things and get input. Particularly huge thanks to Christina Klopot and Daria Tutar and your team, not just for organising the roundtables, sourcing speakers, doing all of those logistics, which is not easy, but also for your work on this report. Really incredible work on this report. Thank you very much. as I say, the work doesn't end here. We do have a website. It's part of the RSE website, and on that we will be posting, and Daria is taking the lead on this, we will be posting a series of podcasts coming up. They're going to be podcast conversations. I think it's true to say that we are still on the lookout for any potential additional contributors. We've got some people in our sites, but if anyone else
and
has
blogs as well.
Yeah, and blogs as well. So if anyone has things that they would like to share, it would be really interesting to hear from you. Thank you all for coming and for being part of this conversation, but please do keep the conversation going, keep responding, keep talking about it with us and with each other. Thank you very much.